Nobody remembers the first empire that tried to hold Vietnam. That is precisely the point. In 111 BC, Han China absorbed the Red River Delta, installed governors, and fully expected this wet, green peninsula to become a permanent province of the greatest empire on earth. It lasted 4 centuries of formal rule before local resistance fractured it. The Chinese returned, and occupation stretched over 1,000 years total. In 40 AD, 2 women from a dispossessed landowning family mobilized the entire Red River Delta in months and briefly expelled the occupiers. This was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how quickly a village network could become a military network when pressed hard enough. The central fact about Vietnamese society is that it organized itself around the commune, a self-governing agricultural unit built on wet rice cultivation. Wet rice is labor-intensive, cooperative, and hyperlocal. It cannot be reorganized from a distant capital. The hydraulic infrastructure, the dikes, the irrigation networks, the planting rhythms, all of it required coordination at the village level, not from imperial offices thousands of miles away. China tried to break this structure for 1,000 years. The villages absorbed the pressure and continued. When the Chinese finally departed in 938 AD, the Vietnamese state that emerged looked almost identical to the one that had existed before. The institutions had survived underground, embedded in paddies and village councils, waiting. Compare this to what Rome accomplished in Gaul: total administrative absorption, language replacement, cultural erasure within 2 generations. Vietnam resisted that outcome not through spectacular military genius, but through an agricultural system that made conquest functionally impossible at the level that actually mattered. You could hold the cities. You could tax the ports. You could fly any flag over Hanoi. The village would outlast you. Every empire that followed would learn this at enormous cost, and none of them learned it before arriving. France arrived in the 1850s with a different theory of colonial control. Earlier empires had tried to govern Vietnam through its existing structures, even while systematically exploiting them. France decided to replace those structures entirely. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but a rational economic calculation. Rubber, export rice, coal, and opium revenues required a fundamentally reorganized society. The French abolished the village communes' administrative autonomy, dismantled the Confucian examination system that had trained Vietnamese administrators for centuries, and concentrated land ownership in the hands of a small colonial and collaborator elite. The opium monopoly alone generated roughly 30% of colonial revenue, meaning the state's fiscal survival depended directly on maximizing addiction among the population it claimed to be civilizing. By the 1930s, the Mekong Delta had been transformed from a landscape of small-scale rice farmers into one of large plantations owned by fewer than 3,000 families, while millions of tenant farmers paid rents consuming 60 to 70% of their harvest. This was not traditional poverty. This was manufactured dispossession, the deliberate destruction of the economic foundations that had given Vietnamese villages their institutional resilience for 2,000 years. Colonial extraction does not pacify populations, it radicalizes them. The same organizational intelligence that had coordinated irrigation networks for centuries now coordinated political resistance. And here France made its fatal intellectual error. It assumed that destroying traditional institutions had also destroyed the social networks those institutions ran on. It had not. The networks persisted in exactly the form that made them hardest to monitor. Dispersed, horizontal, rooted in village relationships that no colonial census could map. A political movement was forming in the very substrate the French had worked to eliminate, and it would carry within it 2,000 years of institutional memory that no colonial administrator had thought to study, and no military force would prove capable of erasing. The convenient story about Vietnam goes like this. After the Second World War, international communism directed from Moscow targeted a vulnerable Southeast Asian nation, and the United States heroically, if unsuccessfully, tried to stop its spread. This story is almost entirely wrong, and it was wrong in ways that American policymakers understood privately even as they repeated it publicly. Ho Chi Minh had been trying to get Washington's attention since 1919, when he appeared at the Versailles Peace Conference carrying a petition for Vietnamese self-determination modeled closely on Woodrow Wilson's own stated principles. Washington ignored him. In 1945, after Vietnamese resistance forces had cooperated with American intelligence against Japanese occupation, Ho Chi Minh declared independence in Hanoi using language borrowed almost word for word from the American Declaration of Independence. Washington looked away again because France was a Cold War ally and France wanted its colony back. The United States then funded approximately 80% of France's military campaign to reconquer Vietnam between 1950 and 1954. This is not a footnote, it is the entire context. When France finally lost at Dien Bien Phu, a defeat shaped by geography and supply lines far more than by any failure of battlefield courage, the Americans did not reassess their assumptions. They stepped into France's position while telling themselves they were doing something categorically different. The Geneva Accords of 1954 mandated nationwide elections for 1956. The American-backed South Vietnamese government refused to hold them because, as Eisenhower acknowledged in his own memoirs, Ho Chi Minh would have won by an overwhelming margin. A state built on the suppression of its own democratic mandate is not a state, it is a timer. By 1965, the United States had deployed combat troops and was running the most technologically sophisticated military campaign in history against a country whose entire economy was smaller than the annual budget of a mid-sized American city. The asymmetry was total, and it meant nothing. American strategists had convinced themselves that superior firepower would solve the political problem at the core of the war. This belief has a name in military theory, the attrition strategy. Its central assumption is that any enemy has a breaking point measurable in casualties. The assumption was catastrophically wrong, not because the Vietnamese were superhuman, but because the structural conditions generating resistance had not been addressed. The land inequality that France had constructed, and that the South Vietnamese government had largely preserved to protect its own political base, meant that the National Liberation Front was not recruiting reluctant fighters. It was recruiting people whose families had been dispossessed for 2 generations. Every village bombed, every family displaced, every field destroyed by aerial defoliation was not a military victory. It was a political loss registered in the very place the war was actually being fought. The United States dropped more explosive tonnage on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia combined than all sides dropped during the entire Second World War. The landscape was physically altered, resistance continued. The Soviet Union encountered the identical structural logic in Afghanistan 14 years later. Britain had confronted it in the mountains of the northwest frontier for a century before that. The pattern is not exceptional, it is universal. When external military force cannot address the internal political grievances generating resistance, escalating that force does not end the war, it deepens it. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was, by every conventional military metric, a defeat for the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front. They suffered catastrophic losses. They held no significant territory afterward. And they broke the American public's willingness to continue a war that its own government had been privately describing as unwinnable since at least 1966. The most powerful military in human history had been outmaneuvered not on any battlefield, but in the structural space where wars are actually decided. The question of whether a society believes the cost is worth the goal. Vietnam was reunified in 1975. The communist government that took power immediately demonstrated that winning a liberation war and building a functional peacetime economy are 2 entirely different skills. The collectivization campaigns of the late 1970s failed with almost mechanical thoroughness. producing food shortages in a country that had fed itself on rice for 2,000 years. The crisis that followed sent hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese into the South China Sea in overcrowded wooden vessels. The invasion of Cambodia, justified by genuine atrocities, produced a decade of conflict that consumed resources the country desperately needed for reconstruction. Vietnam in 1980 was, by most measurable indicators, a failed experiment. And then, in 1986, the government did something that governments rarely do. It admitted it was structurally wrong. The Doi Moi reforms dismantled collective agriculture, restored private land rights, and opened Vietnam to foreign investment. The results were not subtle. Within 2 decades, Vietnam moved from chronic food insecurity to one of the world's largest rice exporters. The village economy, the same village economy that had defeated Chinese administration, French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and American military power, turned out to be enormously productive when left to operate on its own terms. The lesson here is not that communism failed and capitalism won. That framing is too simple and too convenient. The lesson is that the structural foundations of Vietnamese society, the cooperative, locally organized, hydraulically driven agricultural system that the French tried to dismantle and the Americans tried to bomb into submission, had never actually broken. What changed in 1986 was not the society. What changed was the government's decision to stop fighting it. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia. Foreign corporations build factories in the same delta that French rubber planters once stripped bare. The Mekong, which French engineers reshaped to serve plantation agriculture, now moves Vietnamese goods to global markets. Every empire that arrived here assumed Vietnam was a prize to be seized and remade. It was always a system to be understood. Nobody took the time. And the village, patient as water moving through a dike, it will eventually dissolve. Simply kept going,